Hey guys, my name's Spock and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about Soraka. I think Soraka is in a very good spot right now, and by the end of this video you're going to know when to play Soraka, how to play Soraka, how to build Soraka, and of course we're going to finish off with a few little tips and tricks that are really going to get you on your way to mastering her. As usual, I'll put timestamps in the video description, and if you have any questions as the video goes on, feel free to leave a comment and I'll try and get back to everybody. To start off, we're going to talk about Soraka's abilities. Soraka's Q is Star Call. Soraka creates a circular zone on the floor which will damage all enemies within it. The time it takes for this damage to come through depends on how far the zone is from you. The closer it is, the quicker the damage. If she manages to damage at least one enemy, then she will heal herself a little bit. Also, this area will be revealed, so if you use it in a bush, you'll get vision inside it for a short period of time. Soraka's W is Astral Infusion. This is a very basic ability. When Soraka uses her W on an ally, they will be healed at the cost of some health to Soraka. If this is cast while you're still under the effects of rejuvenation, which is the healing from your Q, then the amount of health that it costs you is reduced, and you actually pass on that rejuvenation healing to your ally as well. So it's pretty important to play around using your Q and your W together, at least in the laning phase. Soraka's E is Equinox. Soraka creates a large zone on the floor which will deal damage to enemies and silence them. The enemies will be silenced for the entire time that they are in the zone, and if any enemies are still in the zone when the time runs out, they will be dealt damage again and rooted. Soraka's ult is Wish. Soraka simply calls upon the stars and instantly heals herself and all allied champions. The healing is increased by 50% on targets below 40% of their maximum health. And next, we're going to talk about drafting on Soraka. So in this section, I want you to learn exactly who Soraka is good into, who she's not so good into, and hopefully this will set you up to be able to choose your runes and builds that we're going to talk about in the next sections. So firstly, Soraka is an enchanter support, and typically enchanter supports are bad into hard engage because they are squishy, and when they get locked down they're pretty easy to kill, but they're good into heavy poke bot lanes because they have the sustain to simply heal back any of the damage that they can do and prevent the pokey supports and the pokey ADCs from pushing you out of lane and forcing you on a bad recall. And in general, this is true for Soraka. Some of her biggest counters are champions like Alistar or Thresh, but she tends to be good into champions like Lux or Morgana. What I will say about Soraka is though that she's a pretty safe support. That means that apart from a few exceptions that we'll talk about, most of her matchups tend to come in the 49 to 51% win ratio kind of zone, meaning that she's not very easy to counter, but she's also not fantastic into many specific matchups. The exceptions come with champions that are very, very easy to poke for Soraka. These will tend to be the tanky champions that will have a hard time locking Soraka down, like Rell, but she's bad into scaling supports like Sona. Sona does a lot of what Soraka does in terms of sustain and also in-lane poke, but it doesn't take her that long to overtake Soraka in these aspects, and she also scales extremely well into the late game, and for that reason Sona is Soraka's hardest matchup in fact. So to sum up, Soraka is a pretty safe first pick champion. You don't have to be all that worried about being hard counter picked if you decide to pick Soraka up early, and she's also great if the enemy decides to pick a tank, and she's also even fairly safe into those hard engaged champions like Pyke or Thresh. They don't have that much of a positive win rate on her, and as we'll talk about in the rune section, there are things that you can do to make these matchups better and swing them more in your favor, but I would steer clear of Soraka if you're going into somebody like a Sona, because she can have some problems with Sona early on and especially later on in the game. Next up, we're going to talk about Soraka's runes. Now, by the end of this section, you're going to know exactly when to build which runes on Soraka and how to play around these rune pages to really get the most out of them. So to start off, we're going to discuss keystones. Now, I think there are two viable keystones on Soraka right now, and that is of course Aerie and Guardian. While there is at least some aspect of playstyle and preference in these rune sets, they're actually quite distinct. They serve two different purposes and they're good in different situations. So before we get into the full rune pages, let's just compare these keystones so you know exactly when you should be looking towards each one. So I think it's pretty easy to know when Guardian is definitely optimal. It's my go-to keystone every time I go into a hard engaged champion. This will be supports like Blitzcrank, Nautilus, Pyke, any kind of hook or other engaged champion that really wants to take full-on fights and try and kill you. The reason for this is pretty simple. Guardian gives you a defense towards that hard engage, and hard engage is Soraka's Soraka's counter. As we talked about in the drafting section, Soraka likes going into people that want to do poke and periodic damage because of her excellent sustain, allowing her to just heal it all back up. But for hard engage, you're very vulnerable. You're squishy and you don't have a lot of ability to help your ally champion, especially if they have anti-heals or ignite. So adding in that Guardian to give both you and your ally a shield is really, really important when you're going into hard engage. It also gives you access to bone plating, which we're going to talk about in a second. So it's just overall a great rune set. Aerie, however, is good when Soraka is going into somebody that's very pokey. So when Soraka is going into a good matchup, somebody that she can just sustain all of their poke damage, she won't really want to go Guardian because that Guardian's just going to get popped by some ability like a Xerath Q or a Lux E, and it won't be there when you need it. For that reason, if I'm going into an easy matchup, then I'm looking towards Aerie instead of Guardian. Aerie also gives you a little bit more damage, which allows you to trade a little better with these poke champions to really maximize your dominance in lane. And it also means into non-engaged tanks. These are things like Braum or Taric. I'm looking towards Aerie as well. There'll be some exceptions to this, such as Taric Tristana. There's a lot of cheese that can happen into this comp, and so I'll still be looking towards Guardian because I think they're going to play an engagey playstyle with it. So these are the things that you kind of have to think about, and it should be pretty easy for you to see which one's going to be optimal. Luckily with Soraka, it doesn't matter too much. She's very solid with both of these rune sets. So let's talk about all the sub runes that really make these rune sets work when you need them to. So firstly, Summon Aerie. Of course, this gives us access to the sorcery tree, and on line 1 in every single game, I'm going to take Mana Flow Band. Mana Flow Band is just a fantastic rune to have alongside Aerie. Soraka doesn't have the worst mana sustain in the game, but because Aerie does give you that better trade and poke potential, having better mana regen so you can more liberally use your Q for that poke and those trades is really, really nice. It should also stack fairly easily, and it's just all around a great rune. On line 2, in every single game, I'm going to take Transcendence. Soraka loves ability haste, and this gives you static ability haste spikes very consistently as the game moves on. The passive at level 11 onwards is also useful, not so much as it is on other champions, but you will find it giving you access to yet another use of your E during team fights, which can be a game changer if used correctly. And then finally, on line 3, I'm going to look towards either Scorch or Gathering Storm. Scorch is obviously the lane dominant rune. It has a very low cooldown, but it also does a very low amount of damage. It's best when you're constantly able to hit the enemy, which is of course in lane. And Gathering Storm, of course, is the scaling rune. It doesn't even activate until minute 10, and then it just gets better and better every 10 minutes as the game goes on. It's very easy to pick between these two if you need lane dominance, if you think that you're going to need that extra damage in lane, or if you think that the enemy outscales you, simply making playing around a scaling playstyle not optimal, then look towards Scorch. And if you want to scale, or if you don't think that damage will be particularly useful in lane, then look towards Gathering Storm. Luckily, it's not just Soraka's damage that scales with AP, also her heals and other abilities scale with AP, and they've got some pretty good scalings as well, so that can make Gathering Storm a really fantastic rune, especially if you're expecting the game to go later than say 30 minutes. And then for our secondaries in the Aerie tree, right now I think there's only one option, and that is to go into the Resolve tree and select Revitalize. Revitalize simply gives you a static percentage buff to all of your heals and shields, both incoming and outgoing. This means that your heals from your W, your self heals from your Q, your heals from your ult, and your shields from Aerie will all benefit from this bonus buff. There's also a synergy with your ult specifically because Revitalize gives twice the buff if the target that's being healed is below 40% HP. And of course your ult gives extra healing for targets that are below 50% HP. This means that very often if you're using your ult optimally, then you're getting the real most out of it because Revitalize is also proccing. You'll find that the amount of excess healing that you do simply by taking Revitalize in one game is quite substantial, and I'll take this in every single game. And then alongside Revitalize, we can either take Bone Plating. I like this into pokey champions, which is why you've taken Aerie, but also ones that have burst. So I'll take Bone Plating into say a Lux, because when Lux hits an ability on you, she's often trying to set up another ability or an auto attack for her passive. So if you're expecting a number of attacks to come in at once, Bone Plating is going to be for you. If not though, if you're just going into a really pokey champion and you think that they're going to proc that Bone Plating and put it on its long cooldown in just one attack, this could be say a Senna or a Caitlyn on the enemy team, then you can look towards Font of Life. If you root somebody with your E, or if you hit them with your Q, which applies a slow, Font of Life will proc, and that will just add some extra sustain to your bot lane, which is really nice. And then finally, for the rune shards, in this situation, I'm either going to take double adaptive force and armor, or ability haste, adaptive force and armor. The way I pick through this is basically if I'm taking Scorch, I'm I'm going to take double adaptive, and if I'm taking Gathering Storm, I'm going to take ability haste. And then for summoner spells, I'm going to take flash and ignite. So there you have it, now you know how to build Soraka when you build Aerie. Let's talk about Guardian. Luckily, as we've already gone over the resolve tree, I'm going to skip through these a little bit, because we're just going to take Font of Life, Bone Plating, and Revitalize. Very simple. Luckily, we don't have to make the choice that we made when they are our secondaries, so for the exact same reasons that you would take them as secondaries, that's why we're going to take them here. Where Guardian starts to get a little complicated though, is with Guardian secondaries. The main secondaries that I would suggest with Guardian is to go into the Inspiration tree. In this tree, we're going to take Biscuit Delivery to give ourselves a little bit of extra sustain and mana sustain because we don't have that mana flow band. And then we're also going to take Cosmic Insight. Cosmic Insight offers us summoner spell haste and item haste. It's a really great rune because that item haste does buff Moonstone Renewer, which we're going to talk about in the build section. And the summoner spell haste can be really useful, especially as we're going to talk about, because with Guardian, I tend to take heal on Soraka. And then for the rune shards in this rune page, I will often take ability haste and then double defensive. If I'm going into an AD engaged support like a Pyke, I'll take double armor, but if I'm going into somebody that does more AP damage like Blitzcrank, then I might take armor and magic resist. This is obviously going to depend on the matchup and who you think is going to be doing the damage and what kind of damage they're going to be doing, so you're going to have to rely on your own game knowledge to choose these, but basically the takeaway is to take double defensive because your poke and your trade potential are not that high. And then like I said, for the summoner spells, I'm going to take flash and heal. With access to both Cosmic Insight and Revitalize, it's simply better to have heal on the Soraka. Personally, I always take heal on Soraka right now if I'm playing with the Guardian Keystone. Even if my ADC decides to be stubborn and also take heal, that 18 summoner spell haste is really useful and it means you have heal up all the time. There is another set of secondary runes, however, that is viable with Guardian. That is to go into the sorcery tree and take Nimbus Cloak and Celerity. Once again, you'll be taking heal with this so that when you use your heal, you'll be proccing that Nimbus Cloak, but it's just a very safe rune set. If you use Q and then you get that speed buff away from enemy champions, Celerity is going to help you escape using this. And if you are having a real problem playing into hard engaged champions because they're hitting their skill shots all the time, these secondary runes might help you evade some of those engages and help you dodge while you learn how to dodge without it. Personally, I like to go into Inspiration at the moment, but this is definitely a viable rune set, especially in the lower elos, where playing around those summoner spell cooldowns isn't as important. I would say that these secondaries are based mostly on preference, so I'd suggest giving them both a try and seeing what you like the most and when you like it. So now you know what runes to use on Soraka and when to use them, we're going to talk about Soraka's builds. By the end of this section, you're going to understand what builds you have available to you on Soraka, as well as how to make the choices that will crop up based on team comps and game states. To start off, it's pretty simple. In almost every single game, I'm going to take Spellthief's Edge. Spellthief's Edge is a fantastic starter item on Soraka. She can be very aggressive early on, which is something we're going to talk about in the next section, which means she can stack it very, very easily. If you are going into a hard engaged support, you're using Guardian, and they have a team comp that makes you very nervous. Let's just say for you specifically, you really don't like playing into Pyke. You can look towards Relic Shield. It's a much, much safer option if you're not confident in your ability to trade and poke with the enemy. But honestly, I would always suggest going Spellthief's Edge. It is the better item. So if you're having trouble, I'd force yourself to use it in order to learn how to play around the enemy support better. After that, very early on Soraka, I will always look to build boots. Because you're so squishy, getting locked down will almost always kill you. Getting boots early on allows you to dodge skill shots and just get around very easily, hopefully staying out of the way of the enemy. Boot choices are pretty open on Soraka. You can go defensive boots if they've got full AD or a full AP team, but your core boot choice is going to be Ionian Boots of Lucidity. Also known as cooldown boots, these are just a fantastic item to have on a support, especially an enchanter, because they're giving you that ability haste for your low cooldown abilities to be even lower, and they even give you some summoner spell haste as well, which is awesome, as we talked about in the rune section. Occasionally, I do like to go boots of mobility on Soraka. They are not as good for dodging skill shots because they actually give you a lower speed when you're in combat, but the out of combat movement speed speed is massive, and it's very useful if I feel like I'm going to be leaving lane a lot. One of the most common questions I get asked on stream is, what should I do if I have a terrible ADC, or if my ADC is just not willing to play safely and I don't feel like I can do or accomplish anything in lane? And usually my answer will be that you should roam. Roaming on Soraka is not fantastic because she's very squishy, you can't go in deep ward safely, but if you do decide to get out of lane and you want to go and roam around a bit, Boots of Mobility give you the option to do this much more effectively. Now, once we've chosen our boots, we're going to look towards our mythic item. And as you've probably guessed, that item is going to be Moonstone Renewer. Moonstone is just a great item on Soraka. Because of your low cooldown abilities, you can constantly be buffing and affecting allied champions, keeping that passive stacked during team fights, and it adds a significant amount of extra healing to a kit that's already full of it. So it's just really good. These 3 items are the ones I'm going to build first in every single game, and now we can move on to our legendary items. For these, we start off with a choice, and that choice is between Staff of Flowing Water and Ardent Censer. This is a pretty common choice on enchanter supports, and of course, the answer to which one should you build first will almost always come down to who do you have on your team. If you have an attack speed hyper carry like a Vayne or a Twitch, you're of course going to want to move towards Ardent Censer. It buffs your allies' attack speed, and it gives them on-hit damage, which is fantastic for these champions. But of course, it also buffs your attack speed and your on-hit damage, which is not so useful. For that reason, if you don't have one of these attack speed hyper carries that really just love Ardent Censer and can do so much with it early on, then we're going to look towards Staff of Flowing Water. It offers movement speed and an ability haste buff, and while that might not be as powerful of an option for your ADC, it's still useful. That movement speed is fantastic because it allows them to kite better and just make the most of their range. And of course, that ability haste and movement speed buff that's applied to you is much better than getting attack speed and on-hit damage. So if you're wondering which one you should go to, I think you should always go towards Staff of Flowing Water, because that's going to be better for you personally, as well as being pretty much all around useful for every champion in the game. I can't think of many champions that don't at all want movement speed or ability haste. And then pretty simply, once we've made our choice, we'll just go for the other one. If you really don't have anybody on your team at all that can make use of Ardent Censer, of course you can skip it. This would be in scenarios where you have, say, a Veigar APC. But in 99% of games, you're going to have somebody on your team that wants the Ardent Censer buff, so definitely keep it in mind. And now you've probably got 4 or 5 items already, so we're looking towards our final items. The first item that you should always be considering is Redemption. Redemption is a fantastic all-around item, and it's specifically very good in team fights because of the huge area of effect and the ability to heal allies and damage enemies, as well as the ability to use it from a huge range or after you die. It makes Redemption just a fantastic item. But if your team is being particularly stubborn and the enemy does have an oppressive healing based team comp, then you can definitely forgo Redemption in order to get Chemtech Putrefier. This item applies Grievous Wounds to enemies that you hit with your abilities, and it also gives your allies' next abilities Grievous Wounds at a buffed 60% anti-heals after you heal or shield them. It is not particularly optimal to have this on a Soraka because of your single target healing as opposed to, say, Sona's massive AoE heals, and how good Redemption just is with Soraka in general. But let's face it, in solo queue, sometimes you have to deal with a team that's not being optimal, and if your team is being stubborn and refusing to buy anti-heals, you can definitely look towards this item. You can even look towards it early on if the enemies have somebody like an Aatrox or a Mundo who can get out of control with their healing. But if your allies are building anti-heals, then don't look towards this because it's better for them to have it than you. And there you go. Hopefully now you understand exactly how to build Soraka. As you can see, it's fairly simple. You're normally going to be taking the same build paths with very minor alterations based on team comps, but you do need to be keeping in mind who your allies are and who the enemies are when you make those couple of choices. And finally, we're going to talk about a few little tips and tricks that you can use on Soraka. Now, Soraka is a fairly simple champion, so this segment, compared to our other guides, is a little short, but there are a few things that you really should know about her. The first thing I want to talk about is that Soraka, unlike a lot of other supports, doesn't necessarily need to max an ability. What I mean by this is that on most supports, I would say you should max Q or W first. That means that you get it to rank 5, and then you move on to maxing your next ability. But with Soraka, you're going to want to look towards maxing Q and W. This is because Q is very, very good in lane, so you're going to start by leveling Q up. But when you start to move out of lane, when you're starting to contest more objectives and roam around and laning phase is ended, that's when you should start putting points in W. Now, in some games, you will have already maxed Q by the time you start leaving lane and moving into the mid game, but in most games, you're only going to have 3 or maybe 4 points in Q by the time you start leaving lane, and it's at this point that you move towards putting points in W and getting W to max rank. This means usually on Soraka, I only have those 3 or 4 points in Q by the time I'm going to max my W. Like I said, the reason for this is that Q and W are good in very distinct ways, and also that they synergize because obviously your W can transfer your healing from your Q onto your ally champions. It's just simply good to level them together. The next thing I want to talk about is something that only applies in the very, very early stages of the game. I'm talking level 1, 2, and potentially level 3 as well. And it's just something that I see people missing out on a lot when I look at Soraka VODs. And that is that you can play extremely aggressively into some matchups. Soraka can really take advantage of being very aggressive at level 1 and 2 especially. Most champions are not going to be able to outtrade you, especially if you're hitting your Qs and you're getting that sustain back. And you can really do yourself a favor, help stack mana flow band and also your support item by hitting Qs and auto attacking quite a lot very early on. Just of course remember to keep an eye on the minion waves and make sure that they're not going to hit level 2 or 3 and then just all in you straight away. And then finally, I just want to touch back again on something that I said in the ability section. You need to keep in mind that Soraka's Q does give you vision. This can be very useful in laning phase, but it's also useful when you're out and about, you're warding, maybe you're warding in not such a safe manner. You can use this just as a way to make sure that you're not face checking a bush, and it's just something to keep in mind. And we're done. Thank you very much for watching. Before we go, I want to say that this guide once again was voted on by you guys. So if you want to have a say in upcoming guides, hit subscribe, head over to the community tab on the channel page, and you can vote on what guides we bring out next. And if you do have any questions, just leave a comment below and I'll try and get back to everybody.